Long before familiar continents, seen on modern maps, the Earth carried a very different face. The ground beneath oceans and mountains was never truly still, deep within the planet. Slow currents of molten rock shifted endlessly, pushing enormous plates across the surface with patient force. These movements so gradually that no creature living at the time could have sensed the change. Yet across millions of years, entire landscapes drifted like slow-moving islands upon an unseen sea. Sign could have looked down upon the planet during that distant age. The arrangement of land would have appeared strange and unfamiliar. The continents recognized today did not yet exist as separate identities. Instead, the world was divided into large fragments scattered across vast oceans. Laurentia rested in one region, Gondwana in another, while smaller landmasses, such as Siberia, floated between them. Each carried its own climate, its own rivers and forests, its own evolving forms of life. Immense oceans that seemed endless. The waters moved in kanda tordwi scent, that would send the coastal regions, cold nident, tordi dong, the cordis aid. Along those coastlines, life quati atli. Shallow wetlands spread across low-lying shores where rivers met the sea. Strange forests of early plants rose above muddy ground, their tall stems and primitive leaves forming dense green canopies, unlike any forests seen today. These plants did not yet produce flowers or fruit. Instead, they released clouds of spores into the damp air, allowing new growth to spread across marshlands and riverbanks. Within these humid environments, early animals explored the boundary between water and land. Amphibian-like creatures slipped through tangled vegetation, leaving faint tracks in soft sediment. Some hunted insects near the water's edge. Others rest in warm pools beneath the shadow of towering plants. The world felt ancient, yet full of possibility. But beneath the quiet films of these ecosystems, something far larger was unfolding. The crust did not merely drift apart. At times, it moved toward collision. When two continents neither yielded easily, the ground folded Fonkton ranges that stretched across newly joined lands. Oceans caught between them slowly disappeared, as seafloor, as sunk beneath continental edges. The sea's events folded slowly beyond imagination. 1,000,000 years passed. Then another. Gradually, the wandering fragments of land began moving toward one another. The spaces between them narrowed. Ancient seas shrank as coastlines approached. Island chains were pressed into continents. Valleys collapsed into rising mountains. Life above continued its daily struggle for survival, unaware that the shape of the planet itself was changing. Across tens of movement continued with quiet determination. Gondwana drifted steadily northward. Rafanta shifted closer. Smaller continental fragments followed, god-eyed by the same deep currents within Earth's mantle. By bit, the scattered lands of the planet began assembling into something the world had rarely seen. And as those continents drew nearer, the map of the Earth approached a transformation so vast that it would alter climates, ecosystems, and the course of evolution itself. A time was coming when nearly all land would no longer be separated by oceans. Instead, the continents would meet, and the world would become one. The movement had been slow, almost imperceptible, unfolding beneath oceans and forests for tens of millions of years. But eventually, the drifting continents could no longer remain separate. The invisible currents deep within the Earth continued pushing vast slabs of crust toward one another until the distances between them began to vanish. When continents meet, the encounter is never gentle. Laurentia moved Gondwana, and the ancient ocean that once lay between them began to disappear. The seaflow slowly slipped beneath continental edges, sinking back into the mantle in a process that reshaped the planet's surface piece, by coastlines that had once faced east by coast. Across unimaginable spans of time, the gap closed. The first contact between these enormous landmasses triggered forces powerful enough to raise mountains that rivaled anything seen today. The ground folded and crumpled as if the planet's crust were made of soft clay. Layers of rock pushed upward into vast ridges, stretching across newly connected territories. None of these mountain systems would someday become the Appalachian Mountains. Today those mountains are worn and quiet, their peaks softened by hundreds of millions of years of erosion. But during the birth of Pangea, they rose sharp and immense, towering high into the sky. Their scale may have rivaled the Himalayas, forming a barrier that stretched across the joining continents. And they were not alone. Across the forming supercontinent, additional mountain chains appeared wherever fragments of land collided. Valleys closed. Rivers changed course. Entire landscapes were transformed as the crust adjusted to its new arrangement. Slowly, almost relentlessly, the continents continued merging. Smaller land masses that had once drifted independently were pulled into the growing continental mass. Island arcs collided with coastlines. Ocean basins vanished as their floors were consumed beneath advancing land. What emerged from this long sequence of collisions was something extraordinary. Around 335 million years ago, nearly all of Earth's major landmasses had joined together into a single immense continent. Geologists would later give it a name that reflected its incredible scale. Pangea? From above, the new supercontinent stretched across the planet like a colossal crescent of land. It extended from near the northern polar regions down toward the southern latitudes, connecting environments that had once existed thousands of miles apart. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, the majority of Earth's land existed as one continuous surface. Surrounding this vast continent was an equally immense ocean, known today as Panthalassa. It covered most of the planet's surface, its waters stretching, unbroken, across half the globe. Storm systems traveled across these open seas for enormous distances before reaching land. Within the curved edges of Pangea lay another body of water, the Tethys Ocean. This smaller sea rested between northern and southern portions of the supercontinent, forming a warm, tropical basin rich with marine life. Together, these oceans defined a world unlike the one known today. The scale of the new continent created possibilities that had rarely existed before. Animals living on one side of Pangea could theoretically travel thousands of miles across connected landscapes without ever encountering an ocean barrier. Forests, deserts, and river systems extended across distances that would take generations of creatures to cross. Yet this remarkable unity carried hidden consequences. At first glance, a single massive continent might seem stable, even ideal. But oceans play an important role in regulating climate. When land spreads too widely across the planet, large interior regions become isolated from the moderating influence of coastal waters. And Pangea was enormous. As the new supercontinent settled into place, the climate began responding to its scale. Age, Wolfdaten, but deep, Weser, Gebard, Weave rainfall. Beach age, condition, Warfrosty, more, Morsket. Summers brought intense plains, while winters allowed cold air to sweep across open land without the buffering influence of nearby oceans. The continent that seemed so powerful was quietly creating one of the most challenging environments life had ever faced. Pangea had unified the world's land, but unity, as it turned out, did not mean comfort. And as ecosystems slowly adjusted to this enormous new continent, a far more interesting question began to emerge. What's it actually like to live there? Nemajan standing somewhere deep within the center of Pangea. No cities exist, no dist, nights going on the horizon. Only open land stretches outward in every direction, fading slowly into the haze of distance. If a traveler began walking east or west across this ancient continent, the journey might continue for thousands of miles before the sea ever appeared. The scale of this world is difficult to comprehend. Today, every continent feels bounded. Oceans surround them, shaping climates and limiting the movement of life. But during the age of Pangea, those familiar barriers had vanished. Nearly all land on Earth had merged into one colossal mass, forming a landscape so immense that it changed the experience of living on the planet itself. Near the edges of the supercontinent, where land met the surrounding oceans, life thrived in familiar ways. Warm, coastal winds carried moisture inland, feeding dense forests and wide wetlands. Rivers wound through green floodplains where vegetation grew thick and tall. Amphibians moved through shallow water beneath the cover of towering plants. while early reptiles explored dry ground nearby. These coastal regions felt alive with movement, but the further one travelled from the sea, the more the landscape began to change. The vast size of Pangea created an unexpected problem. Ocean's moderate climate by carrying heat and moisture across the globe. When land stretches too far from those waters, that balance begins to fade. Deep within the interior of the supercontinent, clouds rarely delivered rain. Moist winds lost their strength long before reaching these distant regions. Gradually, forests gave way to open plains. Then plains gave way to deserts. Across enormous stretches of central Pangea, dry landscapes emerged where rainfall was scarce and unpredictable. The ground hardened beneath the sun, cracked by heat during long summers. Dust carried by hot winds swept across barren valleys and rocky plateaus. These deserts were unlike the small arid regions of modern continents. They covered territories larger than many present-day countries combined, forming harsh environments where only the most adaptable life could survive. And even here, the climate continued shifting with the seasons. Summers brought intense heat across inland territories, warming the ground beneath cloudless skies. But winters could be surprisingly cold. Without nearby oceans to store warmth, temperatures dropped sharply when seasonal winds changed direction. Life on Pangea learned to endure these extremes. Yet the supercontinent also offered something remarkable: freedom of movement. With no oceans separating landmasses, animals and plants could spread across distances that had once been impossible. Bend, Bedent nu, Wolle, Bend, Feebands, followed Feedend, Weebas Car, Cod, Wand, Wander, Wanderbockend, Water, Cambers and Dean Fibens, followed Expand, Weavers and She. Over thousands of generations, Belende and Filves across the content. Creatures that had once lived on separate landmasses now shared the same environments. But this new freedom carried its own complications. As climates shifted and deserts expanded, many species found themselves struggling to adapt. Rainfall patterns changed in predictable ways. Habitats that once supported thriving populations could slowly transform into dry or inhospitable terrain. The supercontinent had removed the barriers that once separated life. Yet in doing so, it had also created a world of powerful environmental extremes. Pangea was not simply a larger version of modern continents. It was something entirely different. A planetary experiment unfolding across millions of years. The immense continent reshaped climates, landscapes, and ecosystems in ways the Earth had rarely experienced before. And to understand what life on Pangea truly felt like, one must look beyond its size. Because the real challenge of this ancient world was not the distance between oceans. It was the climate that ruled everything in between. The kindy sick call was not left the surfing bait, understand why, it helps to think about the ocean's end. Today, the oceans act like a enormous sea system. For the warm water flows outward from the tropics returned from higher latitudes. These movements distribute heat and moisture across the planet, moderating temperatures and feeding clouds that bring rain to distant lands, the continents we know now, across the globe, allowing these currents to travel in long looping. In doing so, they soften the extremes of climate that might otherwise dominate the land. But during the Age of Pangea, this balance was disrupted. Nearly all of Earth's land had gathered into a single, massive continent. The surrounding ocean, Panthalassa, stretched endlessly across the planet. But much of its circulating water no longer flowed freely between separated continents. Instead, the enormous landmass stood in the way, redirecting currents and altering atmospheric patterns. The climate system began responding to this new arrangement. Along the outer edges of Pangea, where land touched the surrounding seas, conditions remained relatively familiar. Moist winds rolled in from the ocean, bringing rain and humidity to coastal forests and wetlands. Rivers flowed steadily toward the sea, feeding ecosystems rich with vegetation and life. Storms gathered over warm waters and moved inland, their clouds darkening the skies above coastal plains. But those storms rarely traveled far. The farther inland the air moved, the more moisture it lost. By the time those wind befarvged Wisgate These were not spalkiano-torkets of a ridgesrand like those Carbascard would across. They stretched for thousands of miles, forming vast expanses of sand, stone, and dust. The sun burned intensely during long summers. Without nearby oceans to regulate temperature, heat built quickly across the land. Day after day, the ground absorbed sunlight until the air shimmered above the desert floor. But the same geography that allowed intense heat also allowed sudden cold. When winter arrived, there were no warm seas nearby to store and release heat slowly. Cold air swept across the continent with little resistance. Temperatures dropped sharply as seasonal winds carried cooler air deep into the interior. Pangea had created a world of extremes. Summer heat could scorch the landscape for months. Winter cold could arrive with surprising force. Between these seasons, violent storms sometimes erupted when shifting air masses collided above open plains. Occasionally, rare rainfall reached the desert interior. When it did, dry riverbeds suddenly filled with rushing water. Seasonal rivers appeared where none had existed days before, carving temporary channels across the land before vanishing again beneath the sun. Dust storms rolled across the plains, carrying red sand high into the air. In distant mountain ranges, clouds gathered more reliably. Rising air cooled against the slopes, releasing precious rainfall that fed rivers flowing down toward the lowlands. These mountains became lifelines in an otherwise unforgiving environment. Scientists studying ancient rocks and fossil soils believe the climate of Pangea may have resembled modern continental interiors such as Central Asia or the American Southwest, but magnified beyond anything those regions experience today. The supercontinent had unintentionally created one of the harshest climate systems the Earth had ever known. Yet life did not disappear. Something remarkable began happening. Under these intense conditions, plants and animals were forced to adapt in ways they never had before. Some species vanished when the environment changed too quickly. Others evolved new strategies for survival, developing bodies and behaviors suited to heat, dryness. The climate of Pangea was harsh, but it was also shaping the future of life. And the next question became impossible to ignore. If this world was so unforgiving, what kinds of creatures could possibly survive here? The harsh climate of Pangea did not welcome every form of life equally. Many creatures that had once flourished in earlier ages now faced an unfamiliar challenge. The vast and unpredictable seasons of the supercontinent demanded something new, something capable of surviving far from rivers, marshes, and the steady presence of water. For millions of years before Pangea formed, amphibians had dominated the wetlands of the Earth. Their bodies were well suited for humid environments, where streams and swamps were never far away. Their skin remained moist, their eggs developed in water, and their lives stayed closely tied to damp ground and shallow pools. But the interior of Pangea offered little of that comfort. Across enormous regions of the continent, water was scarce. Rain fell rarely, and when it did, the moisture disappeared quickly beneath dry winds and blazing sun. Wetlands became isolated pockets, scattered across an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Amphibians could survive near these shrinking oases, but they struggled to venture much farther. Another group of animals, however, carried a different set of advantages. Reptiles had evolved a remarkable adaptation that quietly changed the future of life on land. Their skin formed a protective barrier that prevented the loss of moisture, allowing them to endure dry environments where amphibians could not. Even more important, their eggs developed inside protective shells that could survive outside water. This single evolutionary innovation opened enormous new territory. Reptiles no longer needed ponds or streams to reproduce. They could lay their eggs on leaving them protected within levery shells while the next generation slowly developed inside. With that freedom came opportunity. Oppasu Vats, Vatuas, the Vanteria of Pangevals, began exploring landscapes that had rarely supported complex animal life. Some moved cautiously through sparse vegetation, hunting insects among low plants and fallen branches. Others crossed open ground beneath wide skies, adapting to heat and dryness in ways their amphibian relatives could not. The diversity of these early reptiles grew steadily. Some remained small and agile, perfect for chasing insects and small prey across dry terrain. Others grew larger, developing stronger jaws and limbs, capable of supporting heavier bodies. Among the most creatures were the synapsids distant of mammals, that would one day inherit the planet, though often grouped alongside reptiles in the fossil record of the time. Synapsids followed their own unique evolutionary path. This animal moved with slow confidence along the edges of rivers and floodplains. Its body was powerful, supported by sturdy limbs and a heavy tail. But what made it unmistakable was the tall sail rising from its back, formed by elongated bones extending upward from the spine. When the early morning sun rose over the landscape, that sail caught the light. Scientists believe it may have helped regulate body temperature, allowing Dimetrodon to warm itself quickly in the cool hours of morning before beginning its hunt. With sharp teeth and a strong jaw, it became one of the dominant predators of its time. Yet Dimetrodon was only one of many experimental designs unfolding across the supercontinent. Pangea had become a vast evolutionary laboratory. Across deserts, forests, and floodplains, countless species were exploring different strategies for survival. Some grew armored bodies to defend against predators. Others developed stronger limbs for long-distance travel across open terrain. Nature was testing possibilities. It is important to remember that the familiar rulers of prehistoric imagination had not yet appeared. Dinosaurs, whose names would one day echo through museums and documentaries, had not yet taken their first steps. Instead, the world belonged to these earlier pioneers. They adapted, competed, and spread across the enormous continent, shaping ecosystems in ways that prepared the stage for everything that would follow. Life on Pangea was growing more complex with every passing million years. Predators and prey formed new relationships. Vegetation patterns shifted as animals spread seeds and altered landscapes. Ecosystems expanded into territories that had once been barren. And yet, beneath the growing richness of life, the planet itself was preparing another transformation. Deep below the surface of the supercontinent, forces were gathering that would soon test every creature living upon it. For a long stretch of time, the living world of Pangea seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm. Rivers continued their steady journeys across the land, carving wide floodplains through forests and grass, like vegetation. Warm winds from oceans carried, mofderad, where life had incomplexed and complex. Warm, escant, leftegushe. Fiki force beside winding water, wakim laid balkans where, in spalls moved among leaves. Mosses and ferns covered damp ground, while taller plants reached toward the light above. Far from these green landscapes, other forms of vegetation adapted to the drier interior of the continent. Tough plants with narrow leaves clung to life in sandy soil, surviving under intense sunlight and long seasons without rain. Their roots stretched deep beneath the ground in search of hidden moisture. Life had learned to endure the extremes of the supercontinent. Across these environments, animals formed relationships that shaped the balance of ecosystems. Small herbivores grazed among dense plant growth. Larger predators stalked quietly through forests or along riverbanks, watching for movement among the shadows. Insects thrived in enormous numbers, forming the base of food chains that supported countless other species. Over millions of years, these interactions created a web of life that stretched across the entire continent. To an observer standing somewhere on Pangea during this time, the world might have appeared stable. The rivers returned each season. Forests grew back where storms had broken branches or uprooted trees. Animals hunted, reproduced, and moved through landscapes that seemed ancient and enduring. But Earth has rarely remained unchanged for long. Subtle signs began appearing beneath the surface of this balance. In certain regions of the continent, the ground trembled more often than before. Far below the crust, molten rock shifted slowly through the mantle, building pressure against the solid plates above. These movements were part of the same forces that had once brought the continents together. No, they were beginning to prepare something new. Deep fractures formed along enormous rift zones, hidden beneath the land. These cracks did not yet split the continent, but they allowed heat and magma to rise closer to the surface. Volcanic activity increased in scattered regions. At first, the eruptions were small. A plume of ash rising from distant mountains. A flow of molten rock spreading quietly across a barren valley. To most animals, these events were local disturbances rather than global warnings. Yet the Earth was slowly becoming more restless. At the same time, climate patterns began shifting in subtle ways. Rainfall that once arrived reliably in certain regions became less predictable. Some forests struggled to recover after periods of drought. Rivers changed their seasonal rhythms, sometimes shrinking or swelling in ways that altered nearby ecosystems. Plants adapted where they could. Animals migrated toward more favorable conditions when possible. Still, the world remained full of life. The supercontinent stretched from horizon to horizon, its ecosystems complex and resilient. Forests continued growing, deserts continued expanding and retreating, and countless creatures moved across the land in search of food and shelter. To most forms of life, nothing seemed especially unusual, but deep within the geological memory of the planet, a far greater event was slowly approaching. Scientists studying ancient rocks and fossil records would later identify this coming transformation as one of the most devastating moments in Earth's history. The Permian Extinction. At its peak, life on Pangea seemed powerful and unstoppable, spreading across deserts, forests, and floodplains alike. Yet the balance supporting that life was more fragile than anyone could have imagined. Because beneath the quiet surface of the supercontinent, forces were gathering that would soon reshape the planet itself. And when those forces finally emerged, they would push the living world closer to annihilation than it had ever been before. Long before the great reptiles of prehistory walked across open plains, the land itself had already been transformed by something quieter, slower, and far more patient. The architects of that transformation were not animals but plants. Across the immense landscapes of Pangea, forests spread wherever water allowed life to take hold. These were not forests that would look familiar to modern eyes. There were no flowering plants and no grasses waving across wide meadows. Instead, the ancient world was filled with towering ferns, giant horsetails, and early conifer trees, whose shapes seemed almost otherworldly along the edges of rivers and wetlands. These plants grew thick and tall, forming dense green corridors across the land. Some ferns reached the height of small trees, their broad fronds stretching outward like living fans beneath humid skies. Horsetails rose in clustered groves, their hollow stems segmented like delicate bamboo. Much of this vegetation reproduced not through seeds, but through spores, tiny particles carried into the air and scattered across damp soil by wind and water. When conditions were right, new plants would rise quickly from the ground, spreading across wetlands and floodplains in lush abundance. The result was a landscape that felt both ancient and strangely vibrant. Where rivers slowed and widened near the coast, enormous wetlands formed. Muddy deltas spread into the sea, layered with thick vegetation that trapped moisture and softened the edges of the land. These environments became natural shelters for life, places where humidity lingered and shade cooled the ground. Within these green labyrinths, animals found refuge. Amphibians moved through shallow water, beneath tangled roots and fallen branches. Early reptiles slipped quietly through dense undergrowth, searching for insects or smaller prey among the vegetation. Insects themselves flourished in these warm, humid conditions, filling the air with movement invisible to distant observers. These forests did more than shelter life. They quietly reshaped the planet itself. Through the slow process of photosynthesis, plants absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and released oxygen into the air. This exchange happened leaf by leaf, tree by tree, year. Though each plant contributed only a small amount, the combined effect across vast forests gradually changed the chemistry of the planet's atmosphere. Over millions of years, the air itself became richer in oxygen. This transformation allowed animals to grow larger and develop more complex bodies. Without the quiet work of these ancient forests, many of the creatures that would later dominate Pangea might never have evolved at all. Yet the forests of Pangea existed within a delicate balance. Their survival depended on water, and water across the supercontinent was never guaranteed. Along coastal regions and river valleys, rainfall remained frequent enough to support thick vegetation, but deeper inland, conditions grew far more uncertain. As the continent stretched farther from the oceans, moisture struggled to reach its interior. Rivers shifted their courses over long periods of time, sometimes abandoning regions that had once supported thriving forests. Where water disappeared, plants vanished soon after. Dry ground replaced wetlands. Vegetation thinned, giving way to scattered shrubs and hardy plants, capable of surviving with minimal rainfall. The edges of deserts slowly crept outward, forming natural boundaries between fertile land and barren terrain. Even so, wherever water returned, life followed. Floodplains could transform quickly after heavy rains, sprouting fresh growth that spread across the soil. Seeds and spores carried by wind and animals helped plants reclaim ground that had once fallen silent. Across Pangea, these cycles repeated again and again. Forests grew, retreated, and grew once more, shaping landscapes that supported an expanding variety of life. Over time, animals began adapting to the different environments created by this shifting vegetation. Some species remained tied to wetlands and riverbanks. Others ventured farther into open terrain, learning to survive in forests, plains, and deserts alike. As plant life spread across the supercontinent, ecosystems grew increasingly complex, and within those evolving ecosystems, animals began diversifying in remarkable ways, quietly filling every available space in a world, still learning how to sustain life on such an enormous scale. As forests spread across the wetlands and floodplains of Pangea, the vegetation provided food, shelter, and new environments where life could diversify in ways the planet had rarely seen before. Within these ancient ecosystems, creatures appeared that looked both familiar and strangely alien, their bodies shaped by evolutionary paths still unfolding. Walking through one of these forests would reveal a world of experimentation. Some animals carried features that resembled reptiles, others shared traits with mammals, and still others retained the amphibian characteristics of earlier ages. Evolution had not yet settled on the forms that would dominate later eras. Instead, countless species were exploring different possibilities, adapting to the enormous landscapes of the supercontinent. Among the most striking of these creatures were the synapsids. These animals belonged to a lineage that would eventually lead to mammals, but in the Age of Pangea, they were already diverse and widespread. Some synapsids were herbivores, moving slowly through dense vegetation while feeding on ferns and other plants that grew along riverbanks. Others were hunters. One predator in particular stood out among the forests and floodplains of this ancient world. Its name, given millions of years later by scientists studying fossil remains, was Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon moved with deliberate power across the landscape. Its body was supported by strong limbs and a long muscular tail that balanced its weight as it walked. But what made it unmistakable was the tall sail rising from its back, formed by long bones that stretched upward from the spine and supported a thin web of skin. In the morning sunlight, this sail caught the warmth of the day. Scientists believe it may have served as a kind of temperature regulator, helping the animal warm its body quickly after cool nights. Once warmed, Dimetrodon could become an efficient predator, stalking prey along the edges of rivers and wetlands where herbivores gathered. Its jaws were lined with sharp teeth designed for gripping and tearing flesh. For millions of years, creatures like Dimetrodon stood among the dominant hunters of Pangea's ecosystems. Nearby, large, herbivorous synapsids grazed among thick vegetation. These animals formed the base of food chains that supported predators across wide territories. Their heavy bodies moved slowly through forests, feeding on leaves and stems that grew in abundance near water. Smaller reptiles lived among them, occupying different roles within the same environment. Some hunted insects that thrived in the humid air of wetlands and forest clearings. Others developed bodies and quick movements that allowed them to dart through undergrowth in search of prey. Insects themselves had become extraordinarily successful during this time. Warm climates and dense vegetation allowed them to multiply rapidly, filling the air with constant motion. For many small predators, across Pangea, life was diversifying into an intricate network of relationships. Predators pursued herbivores. Herbivores depended on plants. Plants depended on water and sunlight. Each layer of life influenced the others, creating ecosystems that stretched across enormous regions of the continent. Yet, beneath this growing complexity lay a deeper evolutionary story. Some of the animals roaming these forests were beginning to develop traits that hinted at future transformations. Changes in skeletal structure allowed more efficient movement across land. Improvements in metabolism helped certain species remain active for longer periods, even in fluctuating climates. Over vast spans of time, these subtle changes would lead to entirely new forms of life. But in this moment, the outcome was far from clear. The animals that seemed powerful and secure within these ecosystems were only temporary rulers of the land. Evolution had not yet revealed which lineages would endure and which would disappear. Many of the creatures dominating Pangea looked unstoppable, yet most of them would vanish long before dinosaurs ever appeared. The forests and floodplains of the supercontinent were filled with life experimenting with survival. Some species would leave descendants that shaped the distant future. Others would vanish entirely, leaving behind only faint traces preserved in stone. And while life flourished across the vast landscapes of Pangea, another story was quietly unfolding beneath the surface of the earth. Deep below the forests and rivers, forces within the planet were beginning to shift. Forces that would soon change the fate of every living creature on the continent. Far below the forests, rivers, and deserts of Pangea, another world existed. One that no creature walking the surface could ever see. It was a realm of heat, pressure, and slow movement, where the solid crust of the planet rested upon a restless ocean of molten rock. Deep within Earth's mantle, enormous currents of heated material flowed in slow, powerful circles. These movements were invisible from the surface. Lantidi, formhidi, were still pushing beatings far below the suited in order. Fourth, slowdidade, wativis northusevadava sivatididen, burdusevadeft of fafati. These pools of molten rock pressed upward, searching for weaknesses in the overlying layers of stone. The crust above them was thick, but it was not unbreakable. Places it began to fracture. Scientists would later describe these regions as large igneous provinces. Vast volcanic systems, capable of releasing unimaginable volumes of lava and gas. Unlike volcanoes that erupt from single peaks, these systems could spread across entire landscapes, opening long cracks in the Earth's surface through which molten rock could pour. One of the largest of these systems was quietly forming beneath what would one day become Siberia. First, the process unfolded slowly. Small fractures appeared deep underground as rising magma weakened the crust. The land above remained largely unchanged, but subtle signals began to appear across the surface. In distant mountain ranges, volcanic activity became slightly more frequent. Thin plumes of ash occasionally rose into the sky before drifting away with the wind. Streams of lava appeared in isolated regions where molten rock managed to break through the crust. For the creatures living nearby, these eruptions may have seemed like little more than natural disturbances, rare events in an otherwise stable world. Yet beneath the surface, the scale of what was developing was far greater than anyone could imagine. As magma continued, it carried with it enormous quantities of gases trapped within the molten rock. Carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur compounds slowly seeped upward through cracks and volcanic vents, entering the atmosphere in small but growing amounts. At first, the effects were subtle. The climate of Pangea had always been unpredictable, shaped by the immense size of the supercontinent. But now, certain regions began experiencing unusual fluctuations. Seasons grew less reliable. Rainfall patterns shifted slightly in areas that had once followed steady cycles. Some ecosystems felt these changes sooner than others. Plants struggled during extended dry periods. Rivers sometimes occasionally arrived with unusual intensity. These changes were not yet catastrophic, but they hinted at a system beginning to lose its balance. Across the vast landscapes of Pangea, life continued its routines. Herbivores grazed across floodplains. Forests spread wherever water remained abundant. The web of life still appeared strong and resilient. Few signs suggested that the foundations of this world were beginning to shift. But deep beneath the supercontinent, the reservoirs of magma continued expanding. Pressure increased slowly, relentlessly, as molten rock pushed upward against the crust. The fractures widened. More magma rose, and with every passing millennium, the forces gathering beneath Pangea moved closer to the moment when the planet itself would release them. When that moment arrived, it would not simply reshape the land. It would transform the atmosphere, the oceans, and the fragile balance of life across the entire Earth. Because beneath the forests and deserts of the supercontinent, the planet was quietly preparing one of the most destructive events in its history. And when it began, the world would never be the same again. The change did not begin with a single explosion. There was no sudden flash in the sky, no instant moment when life across the planet understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Instead, the transformation began quietly, deep beneath the crust of the supercontinent, in a region that millions of years later would be called Siberia. At first, the ground trembled. Small farsi, from, blå, tin, watibus, wodifarsadis, befarsabi, bequantabi down to quartz, be spray, across, brufidor, glass gold. But this was only the beginning. And then millennia, the eruptions grew larger and more frequent. What had started as scattered volcanic activity expanded into one of the most immense geological events the planet had ever experienced, would later be known as the Siberians, we known as the Siberian Traps. Unlike the cone-shaped volcanoes familiar today, this event unfolded across enormous fissures in the crust. Lava poured out through long cracks in the Earth's surface, spreading outward in thick layers that covered forests, rivers, and entire ecosystems. Each eruption added another blanket of molten rock across the land. The lava fields spanned across millions of square kilometers. Layer upon layer of hardened basalt buried the ancient landscape beneath a growing plateau of dark volcanic stone. From space, had anyone been there to witness it, the region would have appeared as a vast glowing scar spreading across the northern portion of the supercontinent. But the lava itself was only part of the disaster. Each eruption released enormous quantities of gas into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide surged upward from the molten rock. Methane escaped from underground reservoirs disturbed by the intense heat. Sulfur dioxide filled the air with thick, choking clouds. These gases began quietly altering the chemistry of the planet's atmosphere. At first, the changes were gradual. Temperatures rose slowly as greenhouse gases trapped more heat near the surface of the Earth. What had once been a harsh but stable climate began shifting towards something far more dangerous. The warming intensified year after year. Across Pangea, heat waves grew longer and more intense. Regions that had once supported forests began drying out. Rivers shrank as rainfall patterns changed. Lakes evaporated relentless sunlight. As vegetation struggled to survive, entire ecosystems began weakening. The oceans felt the effects as well. Carbon dioxide, released into the atmosphere, did not remain there alone. Large portions dissolved into seawater, slowly altering the chemical balance of the oceans. As the water absorbed more carbon dioxide, it became increasingly. Marine life that depended on stable ocean chemistry began suffering the consequences. Meanwhile, warming temperatures disrupted the circulation of ocean currents. Warm water held less oxygen than cooler seas, and as temperatures rose, oxygen levels in many regions began to fall. Large areas of the ocean became suffocating environments where many forms of life could no longer survive. On land, the situation grew equally grim. Forests across wide portions of Pangea began dying as droughts intensified. Plants that once stabilized the soil disappeared, allowing deserts to expand farther inland. Dust storms swept across regions where vegetation had once flourished. Animals struggled to adapt. Some migrated toward cooler environments, or regions where water still remained. Others simply vanished as food chains collapsed beneath the growing environmental stress. Yet the eruptions continued. For hundreds of thousands of years, lava kept flowing across Siberia. Each new eruption added more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, pushing the planet further away from the balance that had once supported life. What had begun as geological unrest was becoming something far more serious, a planetary crisis. And the most unsettling truth was that there was no single moment when the disaster could be stopped. The Earth itself seemed trapped in a cycle of eruptions, warming, and environmental collapse. The greatest extinction in Earth's history was unfolding, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow, relentless transformation of the entire planet. And as the eruptions continued, their effects began spreading beyond the land. Soon, the oceans themselves would begin responding to the same forces, triggering a chain reaction that would sweep through every ecosystem on Earth, while the land above Pangea struggled beneath volcanic skies and rising heat. Another disaster was unfolding in the waters that surrounded the supercontinent. The oceans had long been the most stable environment on Earth. For hundreds of millions of years, marine ecosystems had evolved slowly and steadily, protected by the vast buffering capacity of the sea. Species of the ijsbergvol wordt voortdurend de plein des desk, waftend, gunnotscape therkezef, sea small, yet the chemistry of the sea depends on delicate balances, and even gradual warming can disturb them. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. As ocean temperatures climbed, the ability of seawater to carry oxygen slowly declined. In shallow regions near the coasts, marine animals began feeling the strain. Fish and countless smaller organisms rely on oxygen dissolved in water, in the same way land animals rely on oxygen in air. As concentrations dropped, many species struggled to survive. The deeper waters of the ocean faced an even. Normally, ocean currents circulate oxygen-rich surface water down into deeper layers, maintaining a balance that supports life at many depths. But warming temperatures disrupted these currents. Water layers began separating instead of mixing. Without circulation, oxygen stopped reaching large portions of the deep ocean. Vast regions became stagnant and suffocating. These areas are anoxic zones, places where oxygen levels fall so low that most forms of life cannot endure them. In the ancient oceans surrounding Pangea, such zones expanded across enormous areas of the seafloor. Marine ecosystems that had thrived for millions of years began collapsing quietly. Creatures that depended on stable oxygen levels suffocated where they lived. Their bodies sank to the ocean floor, joining layers of organic matter already accumulating in oxygen-poor waters. But oxygen loss was only one part of the crisis. The same carbon dioxide released by the Siberian eruptions was also dissolving directly into seawater. When carbon dioxide mixes with water, it forms carbonic acid, gradually making the ocean more acidic. This change may sound subtle, but for many marine organisms it proved devastating. Countless species depended on calcium carbonate to build their shells and skeletons. Coral reefs, shellfish, and microscopic plankton all relied on this mineral structure to survive. As ocean acidity increased, calcium carbonate began dissolving more easily. Shells weakened. Skeletons fractured. Reef systems that had once supported diverse marine life began disintegrating. Among the casualties were trilobites, ancient creatures that had inhabited Earth's oceans for hundreds of millions of years. Once among the most successful organisms in marine history, they now disappeared forever. Entire groups of animals vanished alongside them. Coral reefs collapsed, removing critical habitats for countless other species. Without reefs to shelter them, many fish and invertebrates lost the ecosystems they depended upon. The oceans, once teeming with life, grew quieter. Food chains that had developed over vast stretches of evolutionary time began unraveling. When small organisms disappeared, the predators that relied on them soon followed. The loss spread upward through the web of life like ripples moving across still water. What made this crisis especially haunting was its silence. There were no explosions beneath the sea, No visible warning signs across the ocean's surface. The collapse unfolded slowly, hidden beneath waves that continued rising and falling as they always had. Yet below those waves, entire ecosystems were suffocating. For millions of years, the oceans had been among the most stable environments on the planet. No, that stability was gone, replaced by waters growing warmer, more acidic, and increasingly deprived of oxygen. As life struggled both on land and in the sea, the full magnitude of what was happening across the planet was becoming impossible to ignore. As the eruptions continued, and the oceans changed, the living world entered a period unlike any before it. The effects of heat, poisoned air, acidic seas, and collapsing ecosystems spread across the entire planet. What had begun as geological unrest had become something far more devastating. Life itself was beginning to disappear. Over thousands of years, species that had once flourished across Pangea faded from the landscape. At first, the losses seemed scattered. Certain plants vanished from regions where drought grew too severe. Some predators disappeared when their prey became scarce. In the oceans, familiar creatures stopped appearing in places where they had lived for millions of years. But the losses did not stop. They spread outward, touching nearly every corner of the biosphere. One group after another vanished from the fossil record, leaving behind only fragments of bone shell. Scientists studying these layers of stone would later uncover the full scale of the catastrophe. Approximately 90% of all marine species disappeared. Coral reefs that had supported thriving communities for ages collapsed entirely. Trilobites, survivors of countless earlier environmental changes, vanished from the oceans forever. Whole branches of marine life that had once filled ancient seas simply ceased to exist. On land, the devastation was nearly as severe. Roughly 70% of vertebrate species vanished during this period. Predators that had once ruled forests and floodplains disappeared. Herbivores that shaped the vegetation of entire regions were lost as ecosystems unraveled. The supercontinent that had once supported rich forests and diverse animal life became strangely quiet. Across wide portions of Pangea, landscapes that had once been filled with movement now felt empty. Rivers still flowed toward distant seas, but their banks no longer carried the same abundance of life. Forests that survived the climate shifts stood silent beneath open skies. Many evolutionary lineages that had existed for tens of millions of years were simply gone. The world had experienced extinctions before. Life on Earth had always faced challenges, shifting climates, volcanic eruptions, even asteroid impacts. But nothing in the planet's known history had removed so much life so quickly. This moment would come to be known as the Permian Triassic Extinction, or more simply, the Great Dying. Yet, even in a world so profoundly altered, life did not vanish entirely. A small number of species endured the harsh conditions that had eliminated so many others. Some reptiles proved resilient in the new climates, capable of surviving heat, drought, and unstable ecosystems. Certain ancient relatives of mammals also managed to persist through the environmental turmoil. The sea survivors were not the dominant creatures of the previous age. Many were small, adaptable, and capable of surviving on limited resources. Their strength lay not in size or power, but in flexibility. Slowly, as volcanic activity diminished and the atmosphere began stabilizing, these surviving species started spreading across the empty landscapes. It took millions of years for ecosystems to recover. Plants gradually returned to regions where soils had once been scorched or stripped away. Insects multiplied again, where vegetation reappeared. Rivers slowly regained the life that had once surrounded them. Animals followed these returning ecosystems. The survivors moved into territories that had once been crowded with competitors and predators. No, those spaces were open, waiting to be filled. And within this emptiness, evolution began experimenting once more. The extinction that had nearly erased life from the Earth had also created an unexpected opportunity. With so many ecological roles suddenly vacant, entirely new groups of animals would eventually emerge to fill them. Among those future arrivals would be creatures that no living organism on Pangea had yet seen, dinosaurs. Their time had not yet begun. but the stage was quietly being prepared. Because from the ashes of the greatest catastrophe the planet had ever known, life was beginning its slow and determined recovery, and the next era of evolution was about to unfold. In the long aftermath of the Great Dying, the Earth entered a phase that felt almost unreal. The violence of the eruptions had quieted. The skies were no longer constantly dark with ash. Rivers continued their ancient paths toward the sea. Yet something essential was missing: movement. Across much of Pangea, the world had grown strangely silent. Forests that once stretched across fertile plains had vanished from wide regions of the supercontinent. In some places, only scattered plants clung to life, struggling to reclaim ground that had been scorched, buried, or starved of water. Bare soil lay exposed beneath the sun, broken only by the occasional patch of hardy vegetation. The rivers still flowed, as they always had. Rain still from time, but the vibrant communities of animals that once filled these landscapes were gone. Predators no longer stalked the edges of wetlands in great numbers. Herds of herbivores no longer shaped the vegetation through constant grazing. The intricate web of life that had connected plants, animals, and for millions of years, the planet entered what scientists now call a recovery gap. During this time, Earth was not truly lifeless, but it felt eerily diminished. The atmosphere was still adjusting after the immense volcanic eruptions that had filled it with gases. Temperatures fluctuated unpredictably. Climate patterns remained unstable. Life persisted, but it did so cautiously. Only the most resilient organisms endured the harsh conditions that followed the extinction. Many of them were small creatures capable of surviving with limited food and shelter. Others were adaptable species that could tolerate wide swings in temperature and moisture. These survivors scattered across the continent, occupying isolated pockets where conditions remained barely suitable for life. Among them were strange reptiles, like animals that had managed to endure the environmental collapse. Their bodies were suited to the dry and unpredictable climates that now dominated much of Pangea. Some fed on insects and small prey, while others survived on sparse vegetation that returned slowly to recovering landscapes. Alongside them were certain synapsids, distant relatives of mammals that had proven remarkably durable during the extinction. These animals carried evolutionary traits that allowed them to adapt to changing conditions, making them among the few groups capable of surviving the unstable environment. Together, these scattered survivors began repopulating the silent continent. At first was subtle, a lone animal crossing a riverbank. Small populations slowly expanding into nearby territories. Over generations, their numbers grew, though the world remained far less crowded than it had once been. Within this emptiness lay a powerful opportunity. Before the extinction, ecosystems had been filled with competition. Many species occupied similar limited resources within complex food chains, but now most of those competitors were gone. The survivors found themselves in a world filled with open possibilities. Entire ecological niches stood empty. Rivers lacked large predators. Plains held few grazing animals. Forests that slowly returned were not yet claimed by established species. For those creatures that endured the catastrophe, the planet had become an enormous frontier. They began exploring roles that had once belonged to dozens of different animals. Some species evolved new feeding strategies. Others developed bodies better suited for long-distance travel across harsh environments. Evolution, freed from intense competition, began experimenting once again. The process unfolded slowly across millions of years, but the direction was clear. Life was rebuilding itself, piece by piece, across a planet that had nearly been emptied. And in this quiet period of recovery, a powerful truth about the history of life became visible. Evolution does not always advance during times of stability. Often, the greatest transformations emerge from disruption. The devastation that had stripped Pangea of most of its life had also created the conditions for something entirely new to appear. Within this fragile recovery, a handful of adaptable species were beginning to test new evolutionary paths, experiments that would eventually shape the next great era of life on Earth. As the empty landscapes of Pangea slowly began to refill with life, the survivors of the Great Dying faced a world very different from the one their ancestors had known. Forests returned only in scattered regions. Rivers flowed through wide territories that no longer held the same abundance of animals. The balance of them had been arrayed, a planet filled with opportunity and uncertainty. In this poltered world, a few groups of animals began changing in ways that would shape the distant future. Among the most important of these survivors were a lineage of reptiles known as Archaeas. At first glance, the earliest members of this group were not especially remarkable. They were relatively small creatures, moving cautiously through recovering landscapes that were still harsh and unpredictable. Yet hidden within their anatomy were traits that would eventually give rise to some of the most extraordinary animals Earth had ever seen. One of these traits involved the structure of their limbs. Unlike many earlier reptiles whose legs sprawled outward from the sides of their bodies, archosaurs gradually developed a more upright posture. Their limbs extended downward beneath their bodies, allowing them to move with greater efficiency across land. This change gave them improved balance and endurance, especially when traveling long distances across the dry plains of Pangea. In a world where food and water could be separated by many miles, that advantage mattered. Another innovation appeared within their breathing systems. Early archosaurs began developing more effective ways to circulate air through their bodies, allowing them to remain active even in the warm climates that dominated the supercontinent. With better stamina and efficient movement, these reptiles could hunt, travel, and explore new territories more effectively than many other animals sharing the landscape. They were not alone in adapting to the new world. Certain synapsids, the ancient relatives of mammals, also continued evolving during this period of recovery. Though many synapsid lineages had vanished during the extinction, a few resilient groups survived and began adapting to the changing ecosystems around them. Some developed specialized teeth, capable of processing different kinds of food, instead of identical rows of simple teeth. Their mouths began containing distinct shapes suited for cutting, tearing, or grinding. These changes allowed them to exploit a wider range of resources, from tough plant material to small animals. Their jaws grew stronger as well, capable of delivering more powerful bites. These early adaptations hinted at something remarkable that would appear much later in Earth's history. But during this time, evolution was not moving in only one direction. Across the recovering landscapes of Pangea, countless species were experimenting with new survival strategies. The extinction had roused many competitors, leaving behind empty ecological spaces waiting to be filled. Some animals adapted to life in the open deserts that stretched across the interior of the continent. They developed longer limbs and lighter bodies that allowed them to move quickly across hot ground while searching for food. Others remained near rivers and coastal forests, growing larger as they exploited the returning abundance of plant life in these environments. Predators evolved sharper senses and stronger bodies for hunting in open terrain. Herbivores explored new feeding habits as vegetation gradually diversified. The supercontinent had become a vast evolutionary laboratory. Within this enormous arena, life was rebuilding itself in unexpected ways. Each generation introduced small changes, variations in body shape, movement, and behavior that helped certain species survive more successfully than others. Over millions of years, these small changes accumulated. Gradually, new groups of animals began appearing that had never existed before the extinction. Some of them would soon become familiar to the future world. Among the archosaurs, certain lineages began developing bodies suited for speed, balance, and efficient hunting. At first, they were only one group among many, but the advantages they carried, upright posture, improved breathing, and adaptable movement, would soon allow them to spread rapidly across the supercontinent. In the recovering ecosystems of Pangea, the stage was quietly being set for another transformation in the history of life, because among the many reptiles exploring this new world, one group was beginning to rise above the others. And as these evolving reptiles spread across the landscapes of the supercontinent, they would soon begin shaping ecosystems in ways the Earth had never seen before. Around 230 million years ago, in the long recovery after the Great Dying, a quiet but remarkable development began unfolding across the landscapes of Pangea. It did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. No single moment marked its beginning. Instead, it appeared gradually within the scattered populations of reptiles, already exploring the recovering ecosystems of the supercontinent. Among these animals were the earliest dinosaurs. To modern imagination, the word dinosaur often summons images of towering giants, massive creatures, shaking the ground beneath their weight. But the first members of this group were nothing like the enormous animals that would come later. They were small. Many of them stood no taller than a human child. Their bodies were slender and lightweight, built for quick movement rather than overwhelming strength. Long hind legs allowed them to run swiftly across uneven terrain, while their tails balanced their bodies as they moved through forests and floodplains. One of the earliest known examples is a creature scientists, later named Oraptor. This animal lived in the warm environments of what is now South America, though at the time that region formed part of the enormous southern half of Pangea. Oraptor moved lightly across the landscape, hunting small prey among plants and fallen branches. Another early dinosaur, Herrerasaurus, was slightly larger and more formidable. Its jaws held sharp teeth designed for gripping flesh, suggesting it was an active predator within its ecosystem. These animals shared several features that would later define the dinosaur lineage. Their legs stood directly beneath their bodies, rather than sprawling outward, like those of many earlier reptiles. This upright posture gave them better balance and allowed them to move more efficiently across land. Their skeletons were strong, but relatively light, reducing the energy required to run. These advantages proved useful in the challenging environments of Pangea. Across the supercontinent, food could be scarce, and climates could shift dramatically between seasons. Animals capable of moving quickly and covering large distances often had a better chance of finding the resources they needed. Early dinosaurs were well suited for this kind of world. Yet, despite these advantages, they did not immediately dominate their surroundings. For millions of years, dinosaurs remained only one group among many reptiles, sharing the landscape. Larger predators and herbivores already occupied many ecological roles, and the newcomers had to compete for space and resources. In many regions, dinosaurs were relatively uncommon, but evolution rarely favors sudden rulers. Instead, change usually happens slowly, through small advantages that accumulate over time. Each generation passes along traits that allow certain animals to survive more successfully than others. In the case of dinosaurs, those advantages included speed, efficient movement, and bodies capable of adapting to different environments. Over time, these qualities allowed them to spread gradually across the vast territories of Pangea. They hunted small animals along riverbanks. They moved through open plains and sparse forests. They adapted to regions where other reptiles struggled to survive. At first, their presence might have gone almost unnoticed among the many species, rebuilding life after the extinction. But the seeds of something extraordinary had already been planted. The small hunters darting through the shadows of ancient forests were the earliest representatives of a lineage that would one day include the largest land animals in Earth's history. For now, their rise remained subtle. Yet, the enormous landscapes of Pangea offered something few other places could provide. Space. Across forests and floodplains, stretching thousands of miles in every direction, these early dinosaurs were beginning to explore new territories. And, as they spread across the supercontinent, the unique geography of Pangea itself would begin shaping their evolution in ways that no one could yet imagine. As the scars of the Great Dying slowly faded from the planet, life began settling into a new rhythm across the vast landscapes of Pangea. Forests spread once more along rivers and Kamastyle plains, while hardy vegetation claimed ground across wide interior regions. The ecosystems rebuilding themselves across the supercontinent were not identical to those that had existed before the extinction. They were something new, and within these recovering environments, dinosaurs were beginning to spread. First, their presence was modest. Small hunters moved through woodlands and floodplain competing with other reptiles that had survived the extinction. But as millions of years passed, their numbers increased. Their behavior adapted to the enormous world around them. Pangea offered something few environments in Earth's history had ever provided: space. The supercontinent stretched across thousands of miles, without major oceans interrupting the land. Rivers flowed for great distances before reaching the sea. Forests and open plains extended beyond the horizon in every direction. For animals capable of traveling long distances, this geography offered extraordinary opportunity. Though modern grasslands had not yet evolved, large regions of Pangea-supported forests dominated by conifers, cycads, and other hardy plants. In wetter areas, floodplains nourished thick vegetation that could sustain large herbivores. These regions acted as centers of life where animals gathered to feed and reproduce. Yet the stability of these ecosystems was never guaranteed. Seasonal droughts often swept across wide portions of the continent. Rainfall that nourished vegetation in one region might fail entirely in another. Rivers that once flowed strongly could shrink during long dry seasons. In such a world, animals that could move far and fast had an advantage. Some dinosaurs began evolving bodies suited for covering great distances. Their limbs grew longer and stronger, allowing them to travel across plains in search of food and water. Herd behavior also began emerging among certain herbivorous species, giving them greater protection against predators as they migrated across the landscape. With each passing million years, some dinosaurs grew larger. A bigger body allowed herbivores to store more energy and survive longer journeys between feeding grounds. It also allowed them to reach vegetation that smaller animals could not easily access. Some species gradually developed longer necks, enabling them to browse on leaves high in the branches of tall plants. As herbivores increased in size, the hunters pursuing them evolved sharper teeth and stronger jaws capable of bringing down larger prey. Their bodies grew more powerful, their senses more refined. Across Pangea, an evolutionary race was unfolding. Herds of plant-eating dinosaurs moved across enormous plains, following seasonal patterns of rainfall and vegetation growth. When droughts arrived, these herds traveled farther in search of water and fresh plants. Their migrations could stretch across hundreds of miles, and where the herds went, predators followed. Carnivorous dinosaurs patrolled the edges of forests and river valleys, watching for vulnerable individuals that strayed from the safety of the group. Some relied on speed to chase down prey across open terrain. Others used stealth, waiting patiently near watering holes where thirsty animals gathered. The supercontinent itself was shaping this evolutionary story. In smaller environments, animals rarely needed to travel vast distances, but on Pangea, survival often depended on mobility. Creatures that could endure long journeys and adapt to shifting climates had the best chance of thriving. Over time, these pressures encouraged the development of larger bodies and greater endurance. The immense scale of the continent was quietly guiding evolution toward gigantism. Dinosaurs were not becoming enormous by accident. Their environment favored animals capable of dominating wide territories and surviving the unpredictable conditions of the supercontinent. And with each passing era, some dinosaurs grew larger and more powerful than the generation before. The Earth was slowly becoming home to some of the largest land animals that had ever existed. Yet, even as dinosaurs expanded across the landscapes of Pangea, the supercontinent itself was beginning to show subtle signs of change. Because deep beneath the surface, the forces that had once assembled this enormous landmass were already preparing to pull it apart. While dinosaurs wandered across forests, plains, and river valleys, the land beneath them was beginning to change once again. The enormous continent that had taken hundreds of millions of years to assemble was not as permanent as it appeared. Deep within the Earth, the same forces that had once drawn the continents together were shifting direction. The crust beneath Pangea rested upon the slow-moving mantle, where immense currents of heated rock continued flowing in vast circular patterns. These movements pushed and pulled against the rigid plates of the planet's surface. For a long time, those pressures had forced continents into collision, welding them into a single massive landmass. No, the tension was reversing. Across certain regions of Pangea, the crust began stretching. At first, the movement was subtle, unfolding so gradually that no living creature could have noticed it. Yet beneath the soil and stone, the solid surface of the earth was slowly being pulled apart. Long fractures formed deep underground. Those fractures widened into enormous rift valleys, deep trenches where the land sank stretched. These valleys sometimes stretched for hundreds of miles, slaking across the supercontinent like enormous scars. Within these rifts, the Earth's interior began rising closer to the surface. Magma pushed upward through weakened rock, heating the surrounding crust and occasionally breaking through as volcanic eruptions. Lava flowed across nearby landscapes, while clouds of ash drifted through the air above distant forests and plains. Though dramatic in appearance, these eruptions were still only early signs of a much larger transformation. The rift valleys themselves became new environments within the vast continent. As the ground sank along these fractures, water collected within the lowlands, forming long chains of lakes stretching across the landscape. Rivers flowing across Pangea sometimes changed course, draining into these deep basins, edges of these new waterways, creating narrow belts of life within regions that might otherwise have remained dry. Dinosaurs and other animals continued roaming across the continent, crossing these rifts, just as they crossed rivers or mountain passes. To them, the land still felt endless. The cracks beneath their feet seemed small compared to the enormous scale of the supercontinent. But the forces driving those cracks were persistent. Year by year, century by century, the crust continued pulling apart. The rift valleys widened slowly as magma rose between the separating blocks of land. The ground stretched farther, allowing deeper layers of the Earth's interior to approach the surface. What began as fractures would eventually become something far larger. When the crust stretched far enough, seawater from the surrounding oceans began seeping into the widening gaps. At first, narrow channels connected the rifts to distant seas. Over time, those channels expanded as the separating landmasses drifted farther apart. New oceans were beginning to form. This process unfolded so slowly that no single generation of animals could witness its full effect. Dinosaurs continued migrating across wide plains. Forests still spread across river valleys. Predators hunted, and herbivores grazed much as they had for millions of years. The unity of Pangea was already fading. The enormous continent that once allowed animals to travel from one side of the world to the other was beginning to fragment into separate landmasses. The pieces would drift gradually apart, carried by the same deep forces that had once assembled them. It was a reminder of something fundamental about the planet. Nothing on Earth remains fixed forever. Mountains rise and erode, oceans open and close. Continents gather together and later scatter again across the surface of the world. Pangea had once been the greatest supercontinent the Earth had ever known. No, while dinosaurs still roamed freely across its landscapes, the slow process of its breakup had already begun. And as those drifting continents began separating, the climates, oceans, and ecosystems of the planet would soon begin changing once more. As the fractures within Pangea widened, the shape of the world began shifting once more. What had once been a single immense landmass slowly separated into pieces, each drifting gradually away from the others. The process was slow beyond imagination, yet its consequences would reshape the entire planet. New coastlines appeared where solid land had once stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Long valleys filled with seawater as the surrounding oceans crept inward through widening rifts. What had begun as narrow fractures became inland seas, and over millions of years those seas expanded into young oceans, dividing the ancient supercontinent. These changes transformed the way the Earth's climate moved across the planet. When Pangea had been whole, much of its interior remained isolated from the influence of surrounding oceans. Dry deserts spread across enormous distances, while rainfall struggled to reach the center of the continent. But as the land separated, new bodies of water formed between the drifting pieces. With more ocean touching more coastline, the climate system began redistributing heat and moisture. Warm currents flowed through the widening seas, carrying energy from the tropics toward cooler regions. Moist winds traveled farther inland, bringing rainfall to landscapes that had once been dry and barren. In some regions, Forests returned to places that had previously been dominated by desert. The world grew more varied. Instead of one massive continent controlling climate patterns across vast territories, smaller land masses created a patchwork of environments. Some regions remained dry and open beneath bright skies. Others became lush, with vegetation as rainfall increased along new coastlines. Inland seas and shallow coastal waters created entirely new ecosystems where life could flourish. Where rivers met these expanding seas, lagoons and marshes appeared along protected coastlines. Coral reefs began growing in warm tropical waters, where conditions allowed marine life to thrive once more. Each new habitat opportunities for plants and animals to adapt in different ways. Dinosaurs continued evolving within these shifting environments. Some species thrived in the dense forests that spread along humid coasts. Others adapted to the wide plains that still stretched across interior regions. Certain reptiles became specialists of wetlands and river valleys, while others roamed dry landscapes shaped by seasonal drought. The diversification of life mirrored the diversification of the planet itself. As farther apart, isolated populations of animals began evolving along different paths. Creatures that once shared the same territory slowly adapted to the specific climates and landscapes of their new homes. Over long stretches of time, these separations would lead to entirely new species. The breakup of Pangea was not simply dividing land. It was multiplying possibilities for life. Looking back across this immense span of time reveals something remarkable about the nature of the Earth. What once appeared permanent, the enormous unity of a single supercontinent, was only one chapter in a much longer story. The planet beneath our feet is never truly still. The continents seem fixed on modern maps are quietly drifting across the surface of the globe. Mountains rise and gain, oceans expand and shrink. Landscapes that feel ancient and stable today will one day look completely different. Life has endured these changes again and again. Each time the world shifts, ecosystems collapse and new ones emerge. Species vanish while others evolve to fill the spaces left behind. Evolution continues its slow work, shaped by climates, continents, and the restless forces within the planet. Pangea, the greatest supercontinent the Earth had ever known, could not remain whole forever. Its breakup had already begun reshaping the world, and as its fragments drifted farther apart, the planet itself was beginning to resemble something more familiar. The early foundations of the continents that exist today. The end of Pangea did not arrive with a sudden roar. There was no single earthquake that shattered the continent, no catastrophic moment when the land split apart before the eyes of the creatures living upon it. Instead, the transformation began quietly, deep beneath the immense landscapes of the supercontinent. Far below forests and deserts, heat from Earth's mantle continued to rise slowly toward the surface. The planet's interior was never still. Within the mantle, enormous currents of molten rock moved in slow, circulating patterns. These flows pushed against the rigid plates of the crust above them. Over time, the pressure beneath Pangea began stretching the land outward from within. At first, the stretching was subtle. Across vast distances, the crust began thinning slightly as it was pulled apart by forces too slow for any living creature to perceive. The ground did not split open suddenly. Instead, it bent and strained, responding gradually to the immense pressure building below. Over millions of years, the tension grew. Eventually, the strain, long fractures appeared beneath the surface, lacing through the rock like in drying clay. These fractures stretched across regions that would one day become parts of North America, Africa, and Europe. The fractured blocks of Earth dropped slightly along these newly formed faults, creating deep troughs that stretched across the landscape. These enormous depressions became the first rift valleys of the breaking supercontinent. To someone standing nearby, the changes might have looked modest at first. The ground slowly lowering in a distant valley, new cliffs forming where the land shifted along faults. But over long periods of time, these rift valleys expanded into massive geological features. Some stretched hundreds of miles across the continent. Within these troughs, water collected. Rain and rivers flowed into the sinking land, forming long chains of lakes that followed the lines of the fractures. In some places, wetlands and fertile valleys developed along the edges of these new basins, attracting plants and animals seeking water in otherwise dry regions. The rifts also opened pathways for magma rising from deep within the earth. As the crust weakened, molten rock pushed upward through cracks and fractures. Volcanic activity increased in scattered regions across the continent. Lava occasionally spilled onto the surface, while clouds of ash drifted across nearby landscapes. These eruptions were not yet the massive volcanic events that had once reshaped the planet during the Great Dying. Instead, they were early signals that the crust itself was changing. Above ground, life continued its ancient rhythms. Dinosaurs moved across forests and floodplains as they had for generations. Herds of herbivores followed seasonal migrations across wide plains. Predators hunted along riverbanks where animals gathered to drink. Small mammals scurried through undergrowth beneath towering trees, rarely venturing far into open terrain. To these creatures, the world still seemed vast and unbroken. The fractures significant compared to the enormous scale of Pangea itself. A valley here, a lake there. Such changes were simply part of the landscape. But those quiet fractures marked the beginning of something much larger. Continents do not split apart overnight. The separation of land unfolds slowly, often invisibly across thousands of generations of animals. While ecosystems evolve and species rise and fall, the planet continues reshaping its surface in silence. The rift valleys, spreading across Pangea, were the earliest signs of a planetary reorganization already underway. The supercontinent that once united nearly all land on Earth had begun its long process of fragmentation. And as the fractures deepened and magma continued rising toward the surface, the next phase of this transformation would soon begin reshaping entire regions of the ancient world. As the fractures across Pangea widened, the forces hidden beneath the crust began revealing themselves more openly. The rift valleys that once appeared as quiet depressions in the landscape gradually transformed into zones of intense geological activity. From deep below the surface, molten rock pushed upward with growing pressure. The crust above these rising currents of magma had already been weakened by millions of years of stretching. No, the fractures opened further, creating pathways through which the Earth's internal heat could escape. Along these rifts, volcanic activity intensified. Lava did not erupt from a single towering mountain. Instead, it emerged from long cracks in the ground that stretched for miles across the continent. Rock spilled outscape, glowing brightly as it flowed through valleys. When the lava cooled, it hardened into dark layers of basalt, slowly building enormous volcanic plateaus. They repeated over long periods of time, each eruption spreading fresh layers of volcanic rock across wide territories. Over millions of years, entire regions of Pangea became covered by vast basalt fields formed by these repeated outpourings. The land itself was being reshaped. Ash clouds sometimes rose high into the sky above these volcanic zones. Winds carried fine particles across forests and floodplains, occasionally dimming sunlight in regions far from the eruptions themselves. At the same time, gases escaped from the rising magma. Carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, and other volcanic gases entered the atmosphere, subtly altering the climate around these rift systems. Some regions experienced warmer temperatures or changing rainfall patterns as the atmosphere adjusted to the new conditions. But the most important change was happening beneath the surface. Each time magma rose into the fractures and cooled, it added new material between the separating blocks of crust. This process slowly pushed the landmasses farther apart. What had once been a single continuous continent was now being forced into separate pieces by the rising rock beneath it. The rift valleys widened. The ground continued sinking along the fractures as the crust stretched thinner. Rivers that once crossed these regions now flowed into long troughs that grew deeper with time. Lakes expanded across the valley floors, forming chains of water that stretched across the landscape. Eventually, some of these rift valleys sank low enough to connect with the surrounding seas. When seawater first flowed into these gaps, it formed narrow channels, linking the rifts to the open ocean. Tides moved through the channels, bringing marine life into basins that had once been dry land. Over time, those narrow waterways expanded. As the crust continued pulling apart, the basins deepened and widened. What had once been isolated rift lakes slowly transformed into shallow seas. These were the earliest stages of entirely new oceans. The transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly across millions of years, yet the consequences spread across the ecosystems surrounding these fractures. Animals living near the rift zones faced a world that was constantly changing. Some regions experienced repeated volcanic eruptions that buried forests beneath layers of ash and lava. Plants disappeared from certain areas where heat and volcanic gases altered the soil. Animals that once lived in these environments were forced to migrate in search of safer territory. But in other regions, the changes created opportunities. Where rift valleys filled with water, new wetlands and coastal habitats appeared. Rivers flowing into these expanding basins created fertile environments where vegetation could flourish. Marine organisms moved into the shallow seas, bringing new sources of food for animals living nearby. Life adapted wherever it could. The breakup of Pangea was not merely a geological event separating continents. It was transforming the environments in which plants and animals lived. Landscapes shifted from dry plains to coastal wetlands. New shorelines appeared where forests once stood. Ecosystems were rearranging themselves as the planet reshaped its surface. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the single great continent that had once unified the world began dividing into separate lands. The rift valleys continued widening, and the young seas continued growing deeper. With each passing million years, the fragments of Pangea drifted farther apart, forming the foundations of continents that would eventually resemble the modern world. The fractures that had once been little more than scars across the surface of Pangea were now widening into something far more significant. Over countless generations, the slow pulling apart of the continent had deepened the rift valleys and widened the channels that connected them to distant seas. Eventually, the moment arrived when the cracks in the supercontinent were no longer simply valleys or lakes. They became oceans. At first, the transformation appeared modest. Seawater flowed quietly into the deepest portions of the rift valleys, forming narrow inland seas that stretched across the landscape like long, winding corridors of blue. Tides moved slowly through these new waterways, carrying marine organisms into regions that had once been dry land. But the process did not stop there. The crust continued separating as molten rock rose between the drifting plates. With each passing million years, the distance between the continental fragments increased. The narrow seas widened gradually, expanding outward as the land moved farther apart. These waters would eventually become the earliest forms of the Atlantic Ocean. In the beginning, however, they were still small compared to the vast oceans surrounding the rest of the planet. Long coastlines formed along the edges of the newly separated continents, creating environments that had never existed before. Where rivers once crossed uninterrupted plains, they now flowed toward these young seas. Some rivers changed direction entirely, adjusting their courses as the landscape tilted and reshaped itself. Deltas formed along the new shorelines, where fresh water met salt water in shallow coastal basins. With these new coastlines came new ecosystems. Marine life slowly spread into the expanding seas. Fish, mollusks, and countless smaller organisms colonized the shallow waters, building communities that thrived along the young ocean floor. Coral reefs began appearing in warmer regions where sunlight reached the clear coastal waters. Plants and animals living on land were affected just as profoundly. For millions of years, dinosaurs and other reptiles had roamed across the vast, unified landscape of Pangea. They could migrate across enormous distances without encountering oceans that blocked their paths. Populations of animals spread widely across the continent, sharing genes and adapting together as a single ecological network. No, that unity was ending. As the seas widened between the separating landmasses, animals that once lived within the same territories found themselves divided by water barriers that could no longer be crossed. Herds that once migrated freely across plains now reached shorelines where the land simply stopped. The separation happened slowly, but its consequences were profound. Populations of animals stranded on different continents began evolving along separate paths. Without contact with their relatives across the widening oceans, these groups adapted independently to the climates and environments surrounding them. In one region, a species might evolve traits suited for humid forests. In another, its distant relatives might adapt to open plains or dry landscapes. Over long stretches of time, these differences accumulated. Species that had once been nearly identical slowly became distinct species, shaped by the unique conditions of their isolated homes. The breakup of Pangea was not simply dismantling the world that had existed before. It was creating something new. Dividing the supercontinent as separate lands, the planet was encouraging biodiversity to flourish in ways that had not been possible when the continents were joined together. The oceans expanding between those lands were not barriers alone. They were engines of evolutionary change. As continents drifted farther apart, life on Earth entered an entirely new phase of experimentation. New species emerged, new ecosystems formed, and the foundations of the modern biological world began taking shape. The age of a single unified continent was ending, and in its place, a new world of separate lands and evolving life was beginning to unfold. As the continents continued drifting away from one another, the world that had once been unified under Pangea slowly transformed into a collection of separate lands. What had begun as narrow seas between rift valleys grew wider and deeper, forming oceans that animals could no longer cross. For millions of years, creatures that once roamed across the same continent found themselves living on opposite sides of expanding waters. This separation changed the course of evolution. When populations of animals become isolated from one another, their paths begin to diverge. Without the constant mixing of genes between groups, small differences slowly accumulate. Each population adapts to the conditions surrounding it, shaped by climate, food sources, and the challenges of its environment. Over time, those small differences grow larger. Eventually, animals that once belonged to the same species become something entirely new. Across the drifting fragments of Pangea, this process unfolded again and again. Dinosaurs living on the northern landmasses, regions that would one day become parts of North America and Eurasia, began evolving under conditions different from those on the southern continents. Meanwhile, populations separated across Africa, South America, and Antarctica followed their own evolutionary directions. Each continent became its own laboratory of life. Climate played a powerful role in shaping these differences. Some regions remained warm and humid, where rainfall supported dense forests and rich vegetation. In these environments, plant-eating dinosaurs adapted to feeding among tall trees and thick undergrowth. Long necks allowed some herbivores to reach high branches where food was abundant. Olva freplants the peas forkiabiti condites, biconditilikes and fortiofar, e harsher in wasmorsi, besicnibus hapri. Some species evolved stronger teeth for grinding fibrous vegetation. Others developed bodies suited for traveling long distances in search of food and water. Predators adapted as well. In dense forests, hunters relied on stealth and patience, moving quietly through thick vegetation before striking their prey. In open plains, speed became more important. Predators evolved longer legs and lighter bodies, allowing them to chase prey across wide landscapes. Each environment encouraged different solutions to the same challenge, survival. Over millions of years, the dinosaurs living on these separated continents grew increasingly different from one another. Species with common ancestors slowly developed unique shapes, sizes, and behaviors. The once unified ecosystems of Pangea were giving way to a world of regional diversity. Entire groups of dinosaurs evolved that were found only on certain continents. Some developed heavy armor for protection against predators. Others grew enormous bodies capable of reaching the tallest vegetation across vast floodplains. Meanwhile, smaller and more agile species continued exploring specialized roles within their environments. This gradual diversification produced the beginnings of the dinosaur groups that would later become famous in the fossil record. The towering long-necked sauropods, the armored ankylosaurs, the swift predatory theropods, all of these lineages trace their origins to this period of geographic separation and environmental adaptation. What had once been a single evolutionary story across Pangea was now branching into many different narratives, each unfolding on its own continent. The drifting of the land had quieted the possibilities for life. With continents isolated and ecosystems growing increasingly complex, dinosaurs continued evolving in remarkable ways. Each generation refined the adaptations that helped them survive in their unique environments. And as these ecosystems matured across the separated continents, dinosaurs themselves were approaching the height of their evolutionary success. As the continents slowly continued their long drift apart, the living world entered a period of remarkable stability. Forests spread across warm coastal regions. Rivers carved broad valleys through fertile plains. In many cases, climate softened as new oceans moderated the temperature of the land. Within this evolving world, dinosaurs flourished. What had begun millions of years earlier as a small group of agile reptiles had now become the dominant presence across the continents. Their bodies, behaviors, and ecosystems had evolved together over immense spans of time, shaping a planet where dinosaurs occupied nearly every ecological role available on land. Across floodplains and forests, gigantic herbivores roamed in great numbers. Some of the most impressive among them were the sauropods. These enormous animals carried like living towers above the vegetation. Their bodies were immense, supported by thick pillar like legs capable of carrying incredible weight across long distances. With their extended necks, sauropods could reach leaves high in the branches of tall trees. Entire forests could support these giants, which consumed vast quantities of vegetation every day. As they moved through the landscape, their feeding habits reshaped the vegetation around them, opening clearings and spreading plant seeds across wide territories. Nearby, other herbivorous dinosaurs followed different strategies. Some developed covered with bony plates or spikes that protected them from predators. These creatures moved slowly but carried formidable defenses. Others evolved powerful beaks and specialized teeth that allowed them to process tough plant material, growing close to the ground. Together, these herbivores formed the foundation of ecosystems that stretched across the continents. Where herbivores gathered, predators followed. Carnivorous dinosaurs evolved into some of the most formidable hunters the planet had ever seen. Their bodies were built for power and precision. Sharp teeth lined their jaws, while strong hind legs allowed them to pursue prey across open terrain. Many predators developed keen senses that helped them detect movement from great distances. Some hunted alone, relying on speed and stealth to capture their prey. Others may have hunted in groups, coordinating attacks that allowed them to bring down animals much larger than themselves. Across forests, plains, and wetlands, these hunters stood at the top of the food chain. For tens of millions of years, dinosaurs continued evolving into an extraordinary variety of forms. Hundreds of specific environments and ecological roles. Some were towering giants capable of dominating entire landscapes. Others remained small and nimble, surviving in niches overlooked by larger animals. Diversity of dinosaurs became one of the defining features of the Mesozoic world. Yet beneath this flourishing age lay a deeper story, one that stretched back to the ancient supercontinent that had once unified the planet. The evolutionary success of dinosaurs had its roots in the world of Pangea. The vast landscapes of the supercontinent had encouraged mobility, endurance, and adaptability. Dinosaurs had evolved within those conditions, developing traits that allowed them to survive across changing climates and environments. Even after Pangea broke apart, those evolutionary foundations continued shaping the animals that followed. The continents were now separate, but the legacy of that ancient world still influenced the creatures living upon them. For more than 100 million years, dinosaurs remained the most prominent animals on land. Their presence defined ecosystems across forests, deserts, floodplains, and coastal environments. From the outside, it might have seemed as though their reign would last forever. The Earth had once belonged to earlier creatures that vanished during the Great Dying. No, dinosaurs filled the planet with extraordinary diversity and power. Yet the history of the Earth has never allowed any single group to rule indefinitely. Just as Pangea itself had once seemed unbreakable before it began drifting apart, the Age of Dinosaurs would eventually encounter forces beyond their control. The planet was still changing, and somewhere in the distant future of this ancient world, another turning point was quietly approaching, one that would reshape life on Earth once again. Although Pangea disappeared hundreds of millions of years ago, its presence has never truly vanished from the Earth. The supercontinent no longer exists as a single landmass, yet the evidence of its existence is quietly embedded within the landscapes of the modern world. The clues lie in mountains, rocks, and fossils scattered across continents that now sit thousands of miles apart. Consider the Appalachian Mountains of eastern North America. They, as gentle ridges stretching across forests and valleys, worn down by immense spans of time. Their slopes are covered with trees, and their peaks no longer reach the towering heights they once held. But these mountains were not always isolated within North America. When Pangea existed, the Appalachian Range was part of a much larger mountain system that extended across the supercontinent. The same geological structures found within these mountains can also be traced across regions that are now part of Europe and North Africa. In ancient times, these lands were joined together. Rocks within the Appalachians share remarkable similarities with formations found in Scotland, Norway, and parts of Morocco. The minerals, structures, and ages of these rocks tell the same story. They were formed during the same collisions that assembled the supercontinent. What now appears to be separate mountain ranges were once connected within a single, continuous chain. These geological connections were among the earliest clues that led scientists to suspect the continents had once been united. Fossils provided even stronger evidence. When paleontologists began studying ancient fossils across different continents, they noticed something remarkable. Certain species appeared in rock layers on landmasses that were now separated by vast oceans. Identical fossils of prehistoric plants and animals were discovered in South America and Africa. Similar fossilized reptiles appeared in both Antarctica and India. These species could not have crossed wide oceans, yet their remains appeared on distant continents. The explanation became clear only when scientists began reconstructing the ancient arrangement of the continents. When the pieces of Earth's surface were placed back together in the configuration of Pangea, the fossils lined up perfectly. Animals that seemed mysteriously scattered across distant lands were revealed to have once lived within the same ecosystems. Over time, more evidence continued emerging from the rocks beneath our feet. Layers of ancient sediment revealed patterns of rivers and coastlines that only made sense when continents were reunited. Magnetic signatures locked inside volcanic rocks preserved records of how the plates of the Earth had moved across the planet's surface. By studying these clues carefully, scientists began reconstructing the geography of the distant past. Modern technology has expanded this effort even further. Satellite measurements track the movement of continents with remarkable precision. Computer models simulate the slow dance of tectonic plates across millions of years. These tools allow researchers to rewind the history of the planet and watch the continents drift backward into their ancient positions. With each new discovery, the picture becomes clearer. The supercontinent may have disappeared long ago, but its fingerprints remain everywhere. In the shapes of mountain ranges, the patterns of fossils, and the chemistry of ancient rocks, the Earth remembers its past even when the continents themselves have moved on. Looking at the modern world through this perspective reveals something remarkable. The continents that now seem permanently separated were once part of a single enormous landmass, where dinosaurs roamed and ancient forests stretched across the horizon. The planet has been rearranging itself for hundreds of millions of years, and this raises an intriguing possibility. If continents once gathered together to form Pangea, perhaps the process is not finished. Perhaps the drifting pieces of our modern world are still moving toward another moment when the land will reunite again. Imagine standing on the surface of the Earth long before the world looked the way it does today. There are no familiar continents, no recognizable coastlines. Instead, beneath your feet stretches a single enormous landmass, so vast that its true size is almost impossible to comprehend. You are standing on Pangea. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. If you began walking across this ancient world, the journey might continue for thousands of miles before you ever reach the sea. There are no nearby coastlines to soften the air with ocean winds. The land rises and falls in wide plains, distant mountains, and dry valleys carved by rivers that wander slowly across the supercontinent. The sky above you feels familiar, yet subtly different. The constellations are not quite the same as those seen from modern Earth. Over millions of years, the slow movement of the stars across the galaxy has shifted the night sky. Above the dark landscape of Pangea, unfamiliar patterns of light would stretch across the heavens. Below those stars, life moves quietly through a world, both strange and recognizable. Across open plains in search of water or prey. Some are small, quick hunters darting between patches of vegetation. Others move more slowly, their larger bodies built for endurance rather than speed. In the distance, shapes appear along the edge of a rivulet where animals gather to drink. Rivers wind through the landscape like long silver threads. Forfamplansarsti warstat, wadakavipi vidi bdb vigars karsti, redi region gross, fathi tiwarsti regi. From the influence, the Entiwashid biomati. Deserts stretch across wide territories where rainfall rarely reaches the ground. The sun burns hot during the day, and the nights can grow unexpectedly cold once darkness settles over the land. Sand moves across the desert floor in slow waves shaped by steady winds. Yet even here, life endures. Small animals emerge at dusk. When the heat begins to fade, hardy plants cling to survival in dry soil, their roots reaching deep underground in search of hidden moisture. The desert may appear empty at first glance, but patience reveals a world quietly adapting to its environment. Occasionally, seasonal storms sweep across the continent. Dark clouds gather above distant mountains, releasing sudden rainfall that transforms dry valleys into rushing streams. For a short time, the land bursts into activity as plants absorb water and animals take advantage of the brief abundance. Then the skies clear once more, and the vast landscapes return to their quiet rhythm. Standing within this ancient world, it becomes clear how different Pangea truly was. The immense scale of the supercontinent shaped every aspect of life. The distances between oceans influenced climate. The vast interior das Art testing. The vast of Arcadiascates tested the limits of survival. The forests and river valleys created narrow lifelines where ecosystems could thrive. Yet despite its alien appearance, this world is deeply connected to our own. The mountains, rivers, and ecosystems of Pangea were part of the same planet we inhabit today. The rocks beneath our feet still carry traces of that ancient continent. Fossils preserved in stone reveal the creatures that once walked its landscapes. The world of Pangea is not entirely lost. It lives on within the geology of the Earth and within the evolutionary history of life itself. And by imagining what it would have felt like to walk across that ancient land, we begin to see something remarkable about the planet we call home. Understanding Pangea is not simply about the distant past. It reveals something deeper about the nature of Earth itself. Standing in the modest is eve that the Earth beneath our feet is stable. Mountains appear ancient and unmoving. Continents seem fixed in place on maps that have remained unsung for generations. Oceans stretch across the globe as if they have always existed exactly where they are today. But the story of Pangea reveals something very different. The surface of the Earth is not still. Beneath the landscapes we know, beneath cities, forests, deserts, and oceans, the planet continues moving in slow and steady ways that are almost impossible to notice within a single lifetime. The ground we stand on rests upon enormous tectonic plates that drift across the mantle, guided by forces deep within the Earth. Their motion is measured in centimeters each year. Yet over millions of years, those small movements reshape the entire planet. The continents that now seem permanent have wandered across the surface of the Earth for hundreds of millions of years. They have collided to form mountains, separated to create oceans, and drifted across climates that changed the course of life. Pangea was only one moment within this long planetary journey. Before it existed, earlier supercontinents had already gathered and broken apart. After Pangea disappeared, the continents continued drifting into the arrangement we recognize today. Even now, that movement has not stopped. North America slowly shifts westward. Africa creeps north toward Europe. Australia toward Asia. The Atlantic Ocean widens a little more with every passing year. The changes are subtle, far too slow to feel, but they are constant. If we could watch the Earth from far above across millions of years, we would see the continents moving like pieces of enormous puzzle-edding across the planet's surface. Oceans would expand and shrink. Mountains wear away under the steady work of wind and water. Entire landscapes would appear, transform, and vanish. The world that feels permanent today is simply the current arrangement within this endless cycle of change. Pangea reminds us of that truth. There was a time when North America was joined to Africa, when Europe was connected to Greenland, and when Antarctica lay beside Australia within the southern half of the supercontinent. Creatures moved across lands that are now separated by vast oceans, and someday the continents may gather together again. The Earth does not follow a fixed design. Instead, it evolves slowly through the movement of its crust and the restless currents within its interior. The continents assemble and disperse like dancers, following a rhythm too slow for human eyes to perceive. Through these changes, life continues adapting. Species appear, flourish, and vanish as environments shift around them. Ecosystems expand or collapse depending on the climates created by drifting continents. Evolution responds again and again to the ever-changing stage upon which it unfolds. The history of the Earth is not a static record. It is a story of motion. Pangea existed for tens of millions of years, long enough for entire ecosystems to rise and fall across its landscapes. Yet even that immense continent eventually yielded to the deeper forces shaping the planet. The lesson it leaves behind is both humbling and fascinating. What feels permanent beneath our feet is only temporary. The mountains we see today will one day erode. Oceans will open where dry land now exists. Continents will drift into new arrangements that future civilizations, if any exist, may look upon as the natural order of their world. The Earth continues moving, even when we cannot feel it. And in that quiet motion lies the reminder that the story of our planet has never truly been finished. Today, the world appears settled. Oceans stretch across the globe in patterns that seem timeless. Cities rise on land that feels permanent beneath the weight of human history. Yet the deeper story of the Earth tells something very different. The planet is still moving. Far below the ground, the same forces that once gathered the continents into Pangea continue their slow work. Heat rises from the mantle. Tectonic plates shift gradually across the surface. The landscapes we know today are quietly drifting through time, just as they have for hundreds of millions of years. Most of this movement is invisible to us, but scientists have learned how to read the clues left behind by the planet's past. In laboratories and field sites around the world, geologists and paleontologists continue studying the rocks that preserve Earth's ancient history, layer by layer. They examine sediments, fossils, and minerals that record the environments of long-vanished worlds. Each discovery reveals another fragment of the story. Fossilized plants show how ancient forests spread across Pangea's river valleys. The bones of reptiles and early dinosaurs reveal the creatures that once moved across the supercontinent's vast landscapes. Magnetic patterns locked inside volcanic rocks preserve evidence of how the continents have shifted across the globe. These clues allow scientists to reconstruct worlds that disappeared hundreds of millions of years ago. Through careful study, the ancient geography of Pangea has gradually emerged from the rocks themselves. The positions of mountain ranges, the paths of rivers, and the climates that shaped ancient ecosystems can now be understood with remarkable clarity. Yet even with this growing knowledge, many mysteries remain. Researchers continue searching for new fossils that might reveal unknown species that once lived on the supercontinent. They study deep ocean sediments to better understand how climates changed during the Age of Pangea. Satellites and seismic instruments track the movement of tectonic plates in real time, allowing scientists to watch the slow drift of continents as it happens today. Every new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, and with each piece, the story of Pangea becomes more vivid, but the meaning of that story reaches far beyond the distant past. Scientists emploient scavfrex for superkamsong, weerfer termfreeform, weerfers vroom, weerfods form, weerfods, volkist, weerpiers form, weerfer zeet spread, and weerks, wal coas form. Movement of cacks everything from the chemistry of the atmosphere to the migration patterns of animals. Pangea was not simply an ancient curiosity. It was part of the system that continues shaping the planet today. The Earth beneath us remains a living world. Its crust shifts slowly across the mantle. Its mountains rise and erode. Its oceans change their boundaries across immense stretches of time. Even now, the continents continue drifting. North America edges slowly away from Europe. Africa moves steadily northward. The Pacific Ocean shrinks while the Atlantic grows wider. These changes are far too gradual to notice within a single lifetime. But over millions of years they will reshape the planet again. Future landscapes will not look exactly like the world we know today. New oceans will appear. Mountain ranges will rise where continents collide. The drifting pieces of the Earth will continue their long journey across the surface of the globe. And somewhere in that distant future, the continents may once again gather into another supercontinent. Pangea was one chapter in this endless story. Its forests, deserts, and dinosaurs belong to a world that has long since vanished, yet the forces that created it remain active beneath our feet. The story of Pangea may have ended hundreds of millions of years ago, but the story of Earth is still unfolding. Quietly, steadily, the planet continues writing its history, one drifting continent at a time. Imagine standing on the surface of the Earth long before the world looked the way it does today. There are no familiar continents, no recognizable coastlines. Instead, beneath your feet stretches a single enormous landmass, so vast that its true size is almost impossible to comprehend. You are standing on Pangea. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. If you began walking across this ancient world, the journey might continue for thousands of miles before you ever reach the sea. There are no nearby coastlines to soften the air with ocean winds. The land rises and falls in wide plains, distant mountains, and dry valleys carved by rivers that wander slowly across the supercontinent. The sky above you feels familiar. The constellations are not quite the same as those seen from modern Earth. Over millions of years, the slow movement of the stars across the galaxy has shifted the night sky. Above the dark landscape of Pangea, unfamiliar patterns of light would stretch across the heavens. Below those stars, life moves quietly through a world both strange and recognizable. Across open plains, reptiles travel in search of water or prey. Some are small, quick hunters darting between patches of vegetation. Others move more slowly, their larger bodies built for endurance rather than speed. In the distance, shapes appear along the edge of a river valley where animals gather to drink. Rivers wind through the landscape like long silver threads. Along their banks, vegetant plants cluster near the water, their leaves rustling in warm winds carried across the land. These green corridors offer shelter for countless critter that depend on water to survive. Beyond the fertile regions, the land grows frayvef. Far from the influence of the oceans, the interior of Pangea is shaped by extreme climates. Desert trusts wide territories where rainfall rarely reaches the ground. The sun burns hot during the day, and the nights can grow unexpectedly cold once darkness settles over the land. Settle zone moves across the desert floor, in slow waves shaped by steady winds, wayfinders. Small animals emerge at dusk, when the heat begins to fade. Hardy plants cling to survival in dry soil, their roots reaching deep underground in search of hidden moisture. The desert may appear empty at first glance, but patience reveals a world quietly adapting to its environment. Occasionally, seasonal storms sweep across the continent. Dark clouds gather above distant mountains, releasing sudden rainfall that transforms dry valleys into rushing streams. For a short time, the land bursts into activity as plants absorb water. Then the skies clear once more, and the vast landscapes return to their quiet rhythm. Standing within this ancient Pangea truly was. The immense scale of the supercontinent shaped every aspect of life. The distances between oceans influence climate. The Vitae-centria des sets tested the limits of vitae. The forests and river valleys created narrow lifelines, where ecosystems could thrive. Yet despite its alien appearance, this world is deeply connected to our own. The mountains, rivers, and ecosystems of Pangea were part of the same planet we inhabit today. The rocks beneath our feet still carry traces of that ancient continent. Fossils preserved in stone reveal the creatures that once walked its landscapes. The world of Pangea is not entirely lost. It lives on within the geology of the Earth and within the evolutionary history of life itself. And by imagining what it would have felt like to walk across that ancient land, we begin to see something remarkable about the planet we call home. Understanding Pangea is not simply about the distant past. It reveals something deeper about the nature of Earth itself. Standing in the modern world, it is easy to believe that the Earth beneath our feet is stable. Mountains appear ancient and unmoving. Continents seem fixed in place on maps that have remained unchanged for generations. Oceans stretch across the globe as if they have always existed exactly where they are today. But the story of Pangea reveals something very different. The surface of the Earth is not still. Beneath the landscapes we know, beneath cities, forests, deserts, and oceans, the planet continues moving in slow and steady ways that are almost impossible to notice within a single lifetime. The ground we stand on rests upon enormous tectonic plates that drift across the mantle, guided by forces deep within the Earth. Their motion is centimeters each year. Yet over millions of years, those small movements reshape the entire planet. The continents that now seem permanent have wandered across the surface of the Earth for hundreds of millions of years. They have collided to form mountains, separated to create oceans, and drifted across climates that changed the course of life. Pangea was only one moment within this long planetary journey. Before it existed, earlier supercontinents had already gathered and broken apart. After Pangea disappeared, the continents continued drifting into the arrangement we recognize today. Even now, that movement has not stopped. North America slowly shifts westward. Africa creeps north toward Europe. Australia contoured Asia. The Atlantic Ocean widens a little more with every passing year. The changes are subtle, far too slow to feel, but they are constant. If we could watch the Earth from far above across millions of years, we would see the continents moving like pieces of an enormous puzzle leading across the planets. Oceans would expand and shrink. Mountain ranges would rise and wear away under the steady work of wind and water. Entire landscapes would appear, transform, and vanish. The world that feels permanent today is simply the current arrangement within this endless cycle of change. Pangea reminds us of that truth. Hey, Wade was compi d2 staff de gostein as artatia to compa to con staff o to con. Have does not fall, there's not fog and have it does not fall as far. Instead, it evolves slowly through the movement of its crust and the restless currents within its interior. The continents assemble and disperse like dancers following a rhythm too slow for human eyes to perceive. Through these changes, life continues adapting. Species appear, flourish, and vanish as environments shift around them. Ecosystems expand or collapse depending on the climates created by drifting continents. Evolution responds again and again to the ever-changing stage upon which it unfolds. The history of the Earth is not a static record. It is a story of motion. Pangea existed for tens of millions of years. long enough for entire ecosystems to rise and fall across its landscapes. Yet even that immense continent eventually yielded to the deeper forces shaping the planet. The lesson it leaves behind is both humbling and fascinating. What feels permanent beneath our feet is only temporary. The mountains we see today will one day erode. Oceans will open where dry land now exists. Continents will drift into new arrangements that future civilizations, if any exist, may look upon as the natural order of their world. The Earth continues moving, even when we cannot feel it. And in that quiet motion lies the reminder that the story of our planet has never truly been finished. Today, the world appears settled. Maps show continents fixed in familiar shapes. Oceans stretch across the globe in patterns that seem timeless. Cities rise on land that feels permanent beneath the weight of human history. Yet the deeper story of the Earth tells something very different. The planet is still moving. Far below the ground, the same forces that once gathered the continents into Pangea continue their slow work. Heat rises from the mantle. Tectonics shift gradually across the surface. The landscapes we know today are quietly drifting through time, just as they have for hundreds of millions of years. Most of this movement is invisible to us both. Scientists have learned how to read the clues left behind by the planet's past. In laboratories and field sites around the world, geologists and paleontologists continue studying the rocks that preserve Earth's ancient history. Layer by layer, they examine sediments, fossils, and minerals that record the environments of long-vanished worlds. Each discovery reveals another fragment of the story. Fossilized plants show how ancient forests spread across Pangea's river valleys. The bones of reptiles and early dinosaurs reveal the creatures that once moved across the supercontinent's vast landscapes. Magnetic patterns, locked inside volcanic rocks, preserve evidence of how the continents have shifted across the globe. These clues allow scientists to reconstruct worlds that disappeared hundreds of millions of years ago. Through careful study, the ancient geography of Pangea has gradually emerged from the rocks themselves. The positions of mountain ranges, the paths of rivers, and the climates that shaped ancient ecosystems can now be understood with remarkable clarity. Even with this growing knowledge, many mysteries remain. Researchers continue searching for new fossils that might reveal species that once lived on the supercontinent. They study deep ocean sediments to better understand how climates changed during the Age of Pangea. Satellites and seismic instruments track the movement of tectonic plates in real time, allowing scientists to watch the slow drift of continents as it happens today. Every new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, and with each piece, the story of Pangea becomes more vivid, but the meaning of that story reaches far beyond the distant past. Understanding Pangea helps scientists understand how the Earth itself works. The rise and breakup of supercontinents influence climate, ocean circulation, and the evolution of life. They shape the environments in which species evolve. They determine where deserts form, where forests spread, and where oceans open or close. The movement of chemistry of the atmosphere to the migration patterns of animals. Pangea was not simply an ancient curiosity. It was part of the system that continues shaping the planet today. The Earth beneath us remains a living world. Its crust shifts slowly across the mantle. Its mountains rise and erode. Its oceans change their boundaries across immense stretches of time. Even now, the continents continue drifting. North America edges slowly away from Europe. Africa moves steadily northward. The Pacific Ocean shrinks while the Atlantic grows wider. These changes are far too gradual to notice within a single lifetime, but over millions of years they will reshape the planet again. Future landscapes will not look exactly like the world we know today. New oceans will appear. Mountain ranges will rise where continents collide. The drifting pieces of the Earth will continue their long journey across the surface of the globe. And somewhere in that distant future, the continents may once again gather into another supercontinent. Pangea was one chapter in this endless story. Its forests, deserts, and dinosaurs belong to a world that has long since vanished, yet the forces that created it remain active beneath our feet. The story of Pangea may have ended hundreds of millions of years ago, but the story of Earth is still unfolding. Quietly, steadily, the planet continues writing its history, one drifting continent at a time.